everyone, welcome back to the journey of my YouTube channel, and welcome to a video that is pretty different from one that I've done before. Usually I'm talking about books, which is probably not a surprise even if you're new here, because there are a whole lot of books behind me, and usually on my channel I talk about what I'm reading or what I'm going to be reading or what I have read in the past. But today I'm doing something a little bit different because, as you are probably aware, especially if you clicked on this video and saw the title of it, a very famous and special and awesome fantasy book series and world has gotten a big adaptation recently, is currently getting a big adaptation, I guess I should say, since we're only 2 seasons in and it's supposed to be about a 5-season show. So I thought that I would go ahead and make a review of this last season of the show, since it is based on some books that I talk about quite a bit. You can see them up here: The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion. I know technically it's just the Lord of the Rings appendices, but the show does reference the Silmarillion quite a bit, and cover some things that are in the Silmarillion, as well as extra books like The Fall of Numenor. And these are my favorite books ever, and I've read Lord of the Rings a couple times, not as many times as a lot of people. I really enjoy learning more about the lore. Even I listen to the Prancing Pony podcast, which does a lot of deep dives into the lore. So these are some books that I really enjoy, and they've gotten an adaptation that's getting a lot of attention. But even that, though, would not usually be enough for me to just do a review of a season of a show. But specifically, I wanted to talk about the season of the show because I think after season 1, a lot of people gave up on the show. Season 1 got a lot of criticism, and a lot of deserved criticism. Season 1 was pretty much what you would expect a big budget, big studio adaptation of a nostalgic early 2000s franchise to be. It's pretty similar to the other big budget spin-offs and adaptations of popular IPs that we're getting these days. So season 1 left a lot of people feeling pretty unhappy with the whole series and pretty pessimistic about how the show as a whole was going to go, and I think a lot of people just kind of gave up, and not as many people watched season 2. I think a lot of us just assumed that if it's coming from Amazon, it's going to be bad, it's going to be another Hollywood cash grab kind of a thing, and I actually found season 2 to be quite a lot better than my expectations of it, and to be quite worth watching. And I think it's kind of sad that so many people watched season 1, which was not as good, and then not as many people watched season 2, which was so much better. And it seems like even the showrunners and the writers have been listening to audience feedback and paying attention to what people are saying. I didn't know if they were going to be able to actually improve season 2 after season 1, but I think they actually did almost as good of a job as they could possibly have done given season 1 to build a season 2 on that. So I was like, that is actually very exciting. There is some legitimate artistry in season 2 of this show. There are some things that are actually done very well, and there are so many things coming out of the big studios right now that pretty much everybody is very displeased with, that anytime we get something like this that has some real good in it, I feel like, well, we should probably support this and celebrate this, and hopefully there will be more of this. I think there's a chance that season 3, if season 3 improves as much on season 2 as season 2 did on season 1, season 3 is going to be pretty amazing. And so I'm excited about the possibilities for the show. I don't know if those possibilities are going to materialize or not. I have no idea where the show is going to go. Season 3 hasn't even been officially announced yet, as far as I've heard, so I don't know where the show is going to go, but there's a good chance that it could actually be something really good, especially if there are fans who are excited about it and who are communicating that they're excited about it. And if the studio is really motivated to make season 3 good, then I'm excited about what could happen with it. Also, I did not think that I would be one to defend pretty much anything in Rings of Power, but I have heard some rumors going around about the show that I can definitely see how they got started, but I don't agree with them, and so you might have heard some things about the show that sound extremely concerning, and I kind of wanted to address that. If you're not watching the show because of these specific things that you've heard, then there's actually a little bit more information. I think probably those rumors went around after the early part of the show, but then there were some things in the later part of the season that sort of addressed those concerns. So I actually kind of, for once, wanted to come to the defense of the season and be like, actually, to be fair, it's probably not quite as bad as you've heard that it is. Now, it's definitely not the perfect season, so I don't want to get your hopes up too high, and I will talk about some of the things in this season that, as a big fan of both Lord of the Rings and the rest of the lore of Middle-earth, and just as a reader and a writer and someone who is very passionate about storytelling, there were things in the season that I was not the happiest with, and I will get to that. But I wanted to start out by talking about what was really good in this season, and actually, this will probably surprise you if you have not watched the season yet. It really surprised me, but I think the best thing, and everyone I've talked to about the season pretty much agrees with this, the best thing about the season is their treatment of Sauron. And that may really surprise you if you haven't watched the season, because you might have heard some rumors about them making Sauron this just misunderstood bad guy that we're supposed to feel some sympathy with, that he's almost an anti-hero. And I can confidently tell you that that is not at all what this season is trying to do. And I will touch a little bit more later on why I think some people felt this way. There are some reasons, but don't worry, Sauron is not the misunderstood anti-hero. He is kind of the protagonist of the season, in that he's the character that we follow the most, and he's the one really driving the plot and kind of providing the through line through all of the various storylines that the show covers. But that does not mean that Sauron is at all the good guy, or that we are supposed to sympathize with him in any way. The showrunners actually compared their portrayal of Sauron to Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, which I think is quite a good comparison, where he is the character that is in some ways the most interesting character of the season, which feels weird to say, but he's not interesting in the sense that, oh, complex villain, and that, oh, he had a backstory, so that's why he's bad. He's interesting because he's so deceptive, and because of the way that he is able to control the other characters. It's interesting because at this stage of the story and the history of Middle-earth, Sauron does not yet have an army. He doesn't have the kind of control that we see from him in Lord of the Rings. And yet what he is able to do, even with basically no resources at a time when he is kind of rebuilding from scratch, is really unsettling in a very interesting way, and actually causes him to, in some ways, feel like a more deep character than in the Lord of the Rings. Because in the Lord of the Rings, especially the movies, we basically just see him as the personification of evil. Whereas in the Rings of Power, we get to see Sauron really feel more like a character. He's not just evil. In the movies, he's not even evil incarnate. We just see him as the big flaming eye, right? But in Rings of Power, he's an actual character, and that doesn't mean that he is a slightly good character. But it does mean that he feels like more of, he's a character versus just the idea of evil, and that actually makes him in some ways a lot scarier. Like, who is actually scared of Sauron in Lord of the Rings? Sauron in Lord of the Rings is not that unsettling, except that he's so powerful it feels like, how could anyone ever defeat him? But in some ways he's actually more unnerving in the Rings of Power, because it feels like this is somebody who could get inside my head. Like, if I were one of these people who's around Sauron, I would probably fall for his ploys too. And that's really scary. And that's really scary in a good way, because it kind of calls the viewer to be like, how discerning are you being about the voices that you are letting into your mind? Because if you're not careful, and if you just let whatever voice speak into your mind and say, I'm going to give you exactly what you want, then you might actually find yourself listening to some pretty evil voices, actually. So it's it does make the bad guy the protagonist, but not at all in a way that downplays the evilness of the guy. It actually takes it up to the next notch in how much we are worried about how evil Sauron is. And then there's kind of a similar thing with the orcs as well, where you might have heard that the orcs are much more human in Rings of Power than in the movies, and that is kind of true. We do see an orc family at one point, and originally I was not happy about this portrayal of the orcs at all, but I have been listening to the Rings of Power wrap-up podcast, which is by the same team as the Prancing Pony, and they pointed out a lot of things that I found really helpful to consider about the show, and they especially pointed out the lore about the orcs, where actually it is a thing that in the Second Age, which is thousands of years before the Lord of the Rings happened, the orcs hadn't been quite as corrupted yet, so they would have been slightly more human-like. And also, the orcs having families was always part of the lore of Lord of the Rings. In the movie, it looks a little bit different, where the Uruk-hai are just kind of being pulled out of the mud, and there are definitely some uncertainties, even in the lore, about exactly where the orcs come from. But yeah, the orcs having families is a thing, and we're not used to seeing that because of the movies, but a lot of the things that they referenced in the show actually are present in the lore, or at least are plausible given the lore. I do think the show took the orcs as having families and having more human-like characteristics about as far as you could possibly take it, given the lore. But I'm also personally okay with that because I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm watching this show to explore elements and aspects of Middle Earth that we didn't get to see in the movies, that we haven't really gotten to see featured yet as much as some other parts. So I think that's actually cool. I think what they did with the orcs is okay. It makes sense. And again, they don't make the orcs be actually cuddly teddy bears if you just say some nice things to them. Specifically in the last episode of the season, the orcs, it becomes very clear that the orcs are more than slightly corrupted. They are really very bad. But it is interesting how the show makes us think more about the orcs and how much sentience do they have, how similar to humans are they, um, what is the orc experience, I suppose, if you're looking at it from their perspective and not just the perspective of the people who have to kill thousands of them to beat Sauron. So it's interesting, and I definitely understand the people who still aren't big fans of the way that the orcs were portrayed. But I think that the way that they did it was actually okay and was interesting. And I think moving forward, we may see the orcs be a little bit more similar to what we're used to. So I've talked a lot so far about the bad guys, but I actually do think that there are a lot of good guys who are handled well also. I was initially, and again, I'll come back to this, initially I was a little concerned about how they were portraying some of the good guys, but for the most part, I think they handled most of the good guys pretty well, where there are quite a few people who are legitimately just trying to do the right thing, and they sometimes disagree about how to do the right thing. There's some interesting good guy versus good guy conflict in that, where they're trying to figure out, well, what is the right thing, and that is definitely a theme that we see in Lord of the Rings as well. The good guys are not perfect, but there are a lot of characters who really definitely unquestionably are good guys, and I think that's refreshing. I think if you were concerned that they just make all the characters morally gray, then maybe that's encouraging, because they definitely don't. There are a lot of characters who are definitely the good guys, even when they're not being perfect. And we do get to see quite a bit of the theme of fellowship that we see, obviously, in Lord of the Rings. One of the books is literally called The Fellowship of the Ring, and I think in most of season one, I felt like that fellowship theme was a bit lacking. There was, of course, the great friendship between Elrond and Durin. That was one of the best parts of season one. But for the most part, we didn't see as much fellowship theme as I would have really liked in season one. But in season two, we get a lot more of that. We got a lot more really good friendships, really good relationships between the characters. A lot of these are still mostly friendships between just like 2 or 3 people. We don't get a lot of big groups of friends yet, like in Fellowship of the Ring, but I feel like we're maybe headed toward a direction where we will get some more of those bigger groups of friends, and I think that will be really cool to see. And we're also starting to see several instances of the theme of going up against impossible odds, or being in an impossible situation and still having determination and courage and refusing to give up. We see some really good stuff with the faithful Numenorians, having to choose between safety and faith, and standing strong in the face of that. And on the Middle Earth side, also, we see several cases of people just having to show really deep, strong determination to choose to fight for their friends, to choose to fight for what's right, to not give in to the darkness. And those moments felt the most like Lord of the Rings to me, of anything that we've seen from Rings of Power so far. So I was really excited to see some of that. I hope that we'll see even more of that in the future seasons. I think there will be lots of opportunities for it. There were some really great character arcs leading up to those moments as well. There were some character journeys that built up to those moments really well. Sometimes in smaller side characters, we would see that hope and determination as well. Um, but this season really gave us some really good moments of that. Um, Kind of the similar attitude of Frodo and Sam continuing up Mount Doom, even though it seemed impossible. So that kind of theme and that kind of scene we did get to see several times in this season. So, in other words, where season one gave us some spectacle that was fun, but not a lot of substance, season two still brings the same level of spectacle, in fact, even ups the spectacle, I would say, but actually has some substance as well. Now, not everything about the season was so awesome, of course, and this is where I talk about the thing that I keep saying that I'm going to talk about a little bit more, because unfortunately, my least favorite part of the season was episode 1. I thought it was a pretty rough opening to the season. It starts out by basically trying to explain a bunch of questions that we still had after season 1, and that was kind of helpful, but there's this prologue section that just goes on, and this episode is the episode that you could watch and come away feeling like you're supposed to kind of sympathize with Sauron and the orcs, even though the two are in conflict at the moment. So season 1, or episode 1 rather, just left me feeling very much like I don't even know what I'm supposed to want to be happening in these scenes. I don't know how I was supposed to feel in a lot of these scenes. Who was I supposed to be rooting for? So it just left me feeling very confused. The more I've thought back on it after watching the rest of the season, the more I have been okay with episode 1, and the more I've understood what they're doing with episode 1, and how it does set up things better than I realized that it was. But at the same time, if you believe me that season 2 is worth watching, and go start watching it and watch episode 1 and you're like, what are you talking about, then I would understand that, because unfortunately it was one of my least favorite episodes of the show as a whole so far. I'm not sure that's still the case after watching the rest of season 2, because again, the rest of the season kind of redeems some parts of episode 1. But yeah, just be aware that a lot of the very negative sounding rumors about the series probably come mostly or entirely from episode 1, and it's a bit of a rough start to the season. But the rest of the season I still think is worth it, even though episode 1 didn't set it up as I was hoping that it would. The rest of the season does make it worth it. Just get through episode 1, and once you get to episode 2 is one of my favorite episodes of the whole show, if not my favorite episode of the whole show. There is just some crazy good writing. There was a thing in episode 2 that I thought was going to be a disaster, and they somehow pulled it off so well that it became like maybe my favorite scene of the entire show so far. So there's really good stuff as soon as you get past episode 1. But even beyond episode 1, there were several things that were far from perfect. There are a whole lot of references throughout the season. We saw some of this in season 1 as well, but I felt like there was maybe even more in season 2. References to the Lord of the Rings books, references to the Peter Jackson movies, and references to the deep lore of Middle-earth. And some of all three of those things worked okay, but some of those references in each category just felt very out of place, felt very forced, felt pretty fan servicey. So whether you are coming to Rings of Power as primarily a movie fan, a book fan, or a Middle-earth lore fan, then there will be some references that are put there just for you, and some of them will not really land the way that they were supposed to land. There were some pretty unfortunate direct quotes of book lines from characters who it didn't make a lot of sense to have say them, and the ways that the lines were used just did not make a lot of sense. So unfortunately, there is some of that wink wink nudge nudge kind of reference that we see so much in remakes and spin-offs and things of that type, that we would like to see a little bit less of. There are also a couple whole characters in this season from Lord of the Rings, or at least theorized to be in truth characters from Lord of the Rings, who, I mean, we don't know where their storylines are going, but it's possible that one character in particular could kind of make the whole story of Lord of the Rings make no sense, depending on where the season takes him. So we will just have to see how some of those characters go. There are a lot of things in this season that I think set up really well for really cool things in future seasons. But there are a couple characters, a couple plot threads that are setting up for potentially some problems if the show doesn't take them in a different direction. So again, we'll just have to see how that goes. There are some aspects of the show where you have to suspend disbelief, and suspending disbelief is something that Tolkien was not a fan of and that he wrote about quite a bit. And when I say suspend disbelief, I mean that in this show, I kept asking myself, like, what are distances, for the characters to be from point A to point B in this amount of time, whereas these characters were going from point C to point D in this amount of time. And I'm sure that there's some cross-cutting between storylines that makes some of that make more sense, but it also seems like characters just show up in different locations than they were previously at times, and it just makes the world feel less grounded than it really should. I think it's challenging for us in the 21st century to write times and distances and things as accurately as people did back in Tolkien's time, because we're so used to just being able to Zoom call somebody on the other side of the world. But yeah, sometimes in this season there were times when I felt like this is a little bit more of a Zoom conference where two people in different parts of the world just decided to talk to each other all of a sudden, and I'm not entirely sure how the time and distance of travel actually worked here. Also, there's a very big battle sequence at the end, and I am not the person to critique battle sequences, but I have heard quite a bit of critique of the battle sequence, that there are some things that are quite a bit unbelievable, and I'm sure that's true. I'm sure there are some things that don't make a whole lot of sense from a physics and a tactics standpoint. So unfortunately, they weren't able to make that quite as believable as the much beloved Helm's Deep, which is always used as the positive example of this kind of thing. There are also some characters who get wounded, and then the wounds don't seem to be dealt with in a very realistic way. They just kind of go away, which is another thing that we see in a lot of these recent big budget shows. Massive character wounds that should very, very much be deadly, turning out to be nothing more than a scratch, and it's just not even addressed. So there's a bit of that a couple of times. The show also seems to have an odd thing with doomed romances. Like, I could understand one or two relationships that we know are not going to work out well, but just there are so many relationships that based on the lore, we know this cannot happen, or based on something else in the show, or just the way that Middle Earth works, like this cannot end well. We know for a fact that this is not going to go well. Meanwhile, the actual romances that it would make sense to have in this show, based on the characters in the lore, are just kind of not happening. So I'm a little confused. That's a bit of a pet peeve, just a random thing. But yeah, it's kind of weird. So we'll see where some of those subplots go in the long run. But overall, I definitely enjoyed this season a lot. I always look forward to the episodes, watch pretty much every episode the day that it came out, and it was just always really fun to see what they did next, and then to theorize about what was going to be in the next episode. I've been talking to a lot of friends about it, and it's just been a really fun experience, and I am glad that Amazon has given it to us, because this really could have been a disaster. This season could have been as bad as season one, it could have been worse than season one. And so the fact that they responded to season one by not just giving up because it got a lot of critique, but actually doubling down and making a better script for season two and just executing pretty much everything far better than season one did, I think is really encouraging and exciting. And I am just very glad that that was how they decided to respond to the way that season one went. And also, I saved the best for last, because my favorite part of this season, I think, overall, best thing about it is the music. Like, the music is incredible. Absolutely knocked it out of the park. I remember when season one was just starting to air, and I was thinking, well, it's going to be a disappointment not to have the Howard Shore music. And then we heard the Bear McCreary music, and I was like, this is actually not disappointing at all. This actually perfectly lives up to the musical legacy of Lord of the Rings. And if you're familiar with the Silmarillion, then you know that in that book, all of Middle Earth was created by Eru Iluvatar singing. Like, Middle Earth is music, and so the soundtrack to any Middle Earth adaptation has to be so important and integral to the story itself. And the soundtrack really could not be any better. It's 10 out of 10. It's just fantastic. I've re-listen to several of the songs, especially, I'm going to link two of them in the description. The Song of Tom Bombadil, which is from the credits of episode 4, and The Sun Yet Shines, which is the final song of the season, and especially when you know why The Sun Yet Shines is called that. And man, they are just so good. I think some of the best fantasy music that has been written this decade. It's just out of the park. It's phenomenal. And the two songs are so different because the Song of Tom Bombadil is like gentle and whimsical, and The Sun Yet Shines is like the big fantasy orchestra, doing all the cool epic things with the choirs and everything. It's just so good. And also, I think it's episode 7, or maybe it's episode 6. There's a credit song. From the perspective of a troll, and it is death metal. So I'm not sure how I would have felt about that on its own, but like with the rest of the soundtrack being what it is, I think the death metal song is kind of hilarious, especially because it's from the perspective of a troll. Like it's really funny. So the soundtrack is amazing. The Battle for Eregion is another song that is just absolutely outstanding. So if you like fantasy music or orchestral music at all, I would definitely recommend that you give it a listen. Even if you don't believe me that season 2 is worth 8 hours of your time, that's fine. But trust me, the soundtrack is worth your time. Definitely give the soundtrack a try if you like this type of music, even a tiny bit. So that is my review of season 2 of Rings of Power. I know it's a pretty controversial show. People have all kinds of different thoughts about it, and not everybody is going to agree with me on it, and that is okay. But if you like fantasy shows, if you like Lord of the Rings, I would definitely encourage you to at least give the show a try. At least stick out until episode 2, because I think it's a whole lot better than episode 1. And hopefully season 3 will continue to be even better for us. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Rings of Power season 2 if you've seen it, or season 1 if you've seen that, or what you think season 2 is going to be like if you haven't seen it yet. And I will see you in the next video. Bye.